Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Stihl HL94. I'll go over some of the minor common problems that we run into, and then just a basic general review of this unit itself. And this information will also cover the Stihl FS94 and then also the Stihl KM94 as well, as they share the same engine between all three units. So in just a second I'll bring you in closer and I'll show you what we got. Alright, so if you're not familiar with Stihl and the FS94s and the HL94s and the KM94s, I just got a quick comparison of all three of them here. This is the Stihl HL94, which is the extended head trimmer. This one happens to be an articulated head. And then the Stihl FS94, which is the line trimmer. And then the KM94, which is the combination unit where you can put the different attachments on it. Now, all three of these units share the same engine. The throttle designs are all the same. Basically, the whole power head unit is the same on all of these units. And they did update these units. So the one on the far right here, this is an older unit, and then these two are brand new units. And how you know you're looking at an older unit, you're going to look at the primer itself. On this one here, the older one, the primer is up on the top, and it's a separate primer from the carburetor. The new designs now, the primer is in the front right here, and the primer is actually a part of the carburetor itself. It's integrated in. So that's how you know if you're looking at an older unit, which is the one on the far right, or the two new ones, which are the ones on the left. So that's something to be aware of if you're looking for one of these used. So let me throw this articulated hedge trimmer up on the bench and I'll cover some of the common issues that we find. Now overall, this unit is a solid unit. These things are very reliable. They make good power. They're lightweight. They're just a good, simple, old-school two-stroke design. For some reason, this thing reminds me a lot of the old T230 Shindawas. They're just really good, simple engines. And these HL94s, the KM94s, and the FS94s, I don't think I've seen any major mechanical failures on these units yet that I can remember exactly. Internally wise, engine wise, they are great. They've been holding up fantastic for us, and we sell a ton of them. Now, just visually on the outside of this thing, you're going to see kind of the normal wear and tear. Again, this is an older unit by the primer on the top. You'll see normal wear and tear. You know, here in Arizona, the heat just absolutely wreaks havoc on all the rubber coatings on these handles. So this is common. You will see this. Throttle design on these is really solid, and they hold up really nicely. Not too many issues with them. An occasional trigger will break, something like that. Nothing major. Air filter covers are good. They're pretty solid. The only thing that I don't necessarily like about them is how they attach to the air filter base, and I'll show you that in a second. The engine covers on them are okay. They're fairly durable. They are very flexible, and the plastic is a little bit soft on them. So if they do take a hard impact, like this one's broken right here, if they do take a hard impact, they will break. So that is something to be aware of. And that's just normal wear and tear and abuse, you know, if they're getting thrown around. One of the bigger problems with this thing, as far as abuse goes, it's mainly related to abuse, is just the recoils themselves, the housings, and how they break apart. So a lot of times if these things get pulled out of the trailer, or they get stood up on the ground and slammed down or whatever, these recoils will break very, very easily. So that is something to be aware of. This one actually was replaced, as you can tell, because it was broken. So what happens is this recoil here, the bottom of it is all broken out of it. And this is common. They just don't hold up that well. They're a very rigid plastic, and they do tend to crack very easily. We have brought this to Stihl's attention. I believe we sent them a box of broken recoils so they can check them out and see, you know, they may be working on something with that for fixing it. I don't know. But we did bring it to their attention. Other than that, visually on the outside, as far as the power head of it is concerned, there's not a lot else really to cover here. The gas tanks on these things are really solid. They hold up quite well. This one's worn out just from dragging on the ground or in the trailer. This is kind of common. You'll see this quite a bit. They usually won't leak like this, but they can once they get worn out a little bit more. So that's something to be aware of. The chokes on these things are okay. I'll cover this in a second. I'll discuss a couple things about the chokes on these. The main shaft themselves is good. No real issues with the main shafts on these things. I don't see too many issues. And then the cutter head itself, is pretty good. They do hold up well. I will discuss a couple things on a used one here that I have on the bench, and I'll go over that in just a second. So first, let me get into the carburetor issues and the stuff and the air cleaner and whatnot, and I'll get into those issues first. All right, I just went ahead and pulled this engine cover off of here so you guys can get a better view. And you can see these things are really, really flexible, which is good and it's bad. You know, it's good that they will take an impact, but if you hit them too hard, they will bust apart. And this one's already starting to come apart right here. So that is something you will see on these again. Air filter cover wise, the covers themselves are okay, but these screws that are inside of here, they do tend to pop out, fall out, and get lost, and these things are easy to strip. So you have to be mindful of those to make sure that those screws are in there. And then this brass, this is like a brass insert in here in the base, and these will strip out extremely easily. So you have to make sure that you're not over tightening them or using impacts on them and stuff like that. I just recommend just tightening them down by hand. The air filters on these things are really good. Good design. Typical Stihl air filter. They hold up really, really well. Just when the foam starts to separate from the main body, I recommend just getting rid of them and replacing them. But other than that, no real issues with those things at all. The primer design, again, this is an older unit because the primer is on top, and this primer is separate from the carburetor, as you can see there. And it does have separate fuel lines, of course, for the feed and the return back. I have a couple carburetors here. This is the new design with the integrated primer into it. And you can see the fuel line connections are in the front now. And then this is the older design. This would be mounted just like this. So you've got the main feed fuel line in the front side, and the return is on the back side. Otherwise, the carburetor remains the same. Now, as far as these carburetors, I really don't see a lot of issues with them. I don't have to replace too many of them. They do hold up quite well. Now, these chokes, I'm calling it a choke, but they basically call it an enrichment lever. What it does is you twist it, you push it in, and then it lifts the throttle barrel up, and then that lifts the needle up inside the carburetor, and that basically lets the fuel flow a little bit so you can start it up. These things do get dirty, and they will get sticky. So on the unit itself, what you do is you twist this and you push it in, and as you push it in, the throttle barrel itself lifts. And then when you hit the throttle on these, it pops out like that. Now, over time, especially here where I'm at, these things just get impacted with dirt, and a lot of times what will happen is they will not, when you hit the throttle, they won't pop out. And this one's actually still a little bit sticky. So all you can do, really all you need to do, is just take some brake parts cleaner or carburetor cleaner and just get in there and clean between the two plastics. You have the black outer housing and then this orange piece as well. Just get in there and blow the brake parts cleaner or whatever in there and clean it out, blow it out. You can hit it with some light oil once you're done too, like a WD-40, just something really light. You can do that. So, and then that'll help that. The wiring and everything on these is fine. No real major issues. The newer design does have the data port down here, and I have seen a couple small issues with just vibration in the wires, the connections and whatnot I've had to repair in the past, but for the most part, nothing really too major to complain about there. The coils on these, every once in a while I do have to do a coil, not too many of them, maybe a couple a year, something like that. And like I said, I sell a ton of these things, so I really don't see too many major problems with the coils. And again, engine-wise, internally, these things are fantastic. I really don't see a lot of problems. They're very reliable. The other major issue that I do see with these units as well would be the front fan housing. This is a new one right here, and then that part is this right here. So what happens is there's a bearing inside this fan housing, and your clutch drum goes through this as well. So this goes over, there's your clutch, and your flywheel, and then this piece goes over it and covers that. So what happens is this bearing will seize. This is a non-serviceable bearing, and it basically will dry out and it'll seize up, and then it'll spin the bearing in the plastic housing, and again it's non-serviceable, and it basically destroys the housing once the bearing goes out, and then you have to replace the whole housing. So when you switch one of these things out, there's a little bit of labor involved. Obviously you have to switch the clutch drum over, and then this front snout piece, which is this here, there's a big rubber casing in here for dampening, so you have to pull all that stuff out and switch it all over onto your new one. So that is another major thing that I do see. I do see quite a bit of these fail. I've replaced many of them, but not a huge deal. I think this thing is, I want to say it's like 30 bucks, but if the unit is under warranty, they will cover it under warranty. So that is something to be aware of if you are looking for one of these things used and you fire it up and you do hear a weird bearing type sound coming from up here. That's probably what it is that bearing is dry and is getting ready to seize. So something to be aware of with that. Otherwise, clutch wise and all this, I really don't see any issues with the clutches on these things. I haven't had any issues with them at all. They've been very reliable. Next, let me get into the cutter head. Okay, as for the cutter units themselves, they do have a couple minor flaws. Now I just took that one cutter head off that unit I just had just so I could, it's easier to show it that way. And then I have an old one here that's had some damage done to it. One thing is with these bars will break very easily if you're not careful, as you can see here. So if you have these things on a trailer or you're throwing them in and out of the trailer, they're mounted to the side of the trailer and they do flex a lot. You have to be careful with them, or if they get stuck in a tree or a bush or something, the guys are pulling on it and twisting it around. Be mindful that these things can break very easily. And this entire housing itself is very expensive. It's somewhere right around $140 just for the bare housing. And then you have the labor of switching all the blades and gears and everything over onto the new one. So a lot of times it's very close, depending on what kind of condition your blades are in, it's very close to the cost of a new replacement. So that's something to be aware of there. Now as far as the blades themselves are okay. They hold up pretty well. Now this one suffered some severe damage here. This customer actually hit something. I think they hit some rebar or something like that, and it just destroyed it. It broke the blades, it broke the bar. Other than that, inside the gearbox is fine. They hold up quite well. I haven't seen any major issues inside the gearboxes. This one's just dirty because it's been sitting on our shelf forever. This is just a parts unit. We just, we'll hold on to stuff like this, kind of scavenge parts out of it if we need it. But otherwise, the gears, everything inside of it, no issues with those whatsoever. Haven't seen too many problems. One thing to be mindful of with these now, with any Stihl product, is the blade bolts themselves. You want to make sure that every one of these things are tight. And if you watched my video on hedge trimmer sharpening, I'll link it up above, and I'll put it, it's in a playlist too on my channel. Now you want to make sure each and every one of these bolts are tight, otherwise it can create all kinds of problems for you if you don't. Now these bolts, you have the main bolt with a washer, and then you have this little spacer in here, and you want to make sure you retain these spacers, because this is what gives you your separation or your gap on your blades so they function properly. And what happens is if you don't keep them tight, all these bolts tight, the blades start to separate on you, and then basically you can get a lot of debris built up in between the blades, and it just pushes the blades apart, and your cutting basically goes away, and you'll have to pull them all apart and clean them and possibly resharpen them as well. A lot of guys, what happens is if they're not running right, and they think the machine's not running right and it's losing power, a lot of times they blame the blades, and they'll just start loosening all these bolts up, thinking that it's the head itself when it could be something unrelated or it's engine related. So we see it quite a bit. So we have to really make sure that we tell the guys that make sure these things are tight all the time. They're not like Echoes. Like Echoes, you can, some of the Echoes, not all of them, but some of the Echoes you can adjust each one of these individually. But these you cannot. Now, as far as these handles do break on occasion, I will see them broken. Again, it's just from abuse. The pivot head itself and the attachment up here, no real major issues with these at all. They hold up okay. Now, one thing you want to be aware of with this sleeve here, this thing pulls out and it's spring-loaded because this unlocks the pivot right here so you can pivot the head. Right in here is basically a bolt with a spring, and it screws into the body here. You want to just make sure that this is tight and it's not backing out. Every once in a while that thing will come loose. You can see it there. It will come loose and it will back out. So just make sure that thing is tight. Other than that, this pivot head, the gears in here and everything, no real major issues at all. With these, you just want to make sure, of course, that you grease them. There's two different grease ports. There's one here for the gearbox, and then there's one here on the front side for the pivot head. The pivot head doesn't need a lot, just a little tiny squirt every once in a while. Now, they do make a fixed model as well that is non-articulated. It's just a straight, and basically the same things apply to that one as well. It's the same basic bar design. It just doesn't have the pivot head on it, and it is prone to breaking as well, so you want to be mindful with those if you do have a straight one. So as far as the cutter heads themselves, that's pretty much it. There's really not a lot to them. They do hold up well. You just want to make sure you're sharpening them regularly, not getting them too worn out. Like this one in this case, the edges of this blade are pretty worn out. They're pretty rounded out, and you know, the longer you let them get dull, the more material I got to take off to sharpen it, so you don't want to let them get too bad. As far as that goes, that's pretty much it with these. There's really not a lot to them, and they've been pretty reliable. One other thing on these throttle designs and this handle, this was a bit of a learning curve when these first came out. Now, this little wheel right here is basically a restrictor, if you will, or a throttle stop. So if you turn this thing, it limits how much throttle you can give it. So with this thing all the way back, it'll basically almost no throttle. It locks it out. And then as you roll it forward, it allows for full throttle, like that. So if you have a customer come in with one of these things and they're complaining it has no power, check this first. This is the first thing I check. When these first came out, we had customers come back the same day actually and say, man, this thing doesn't have any power. I don't know. I just bought it. I don't know what's wrong with it. And then basically we just ended up checking this wheel and like, oh yeah, this wheel right here got moved. And you're like, oh, okay. So that is something to be aware of. If they're complaining about a non-power issue, that's the first thing to check. So there's a quick review on the Stihl HL94 and some of the common problems that we see. And again, the information that I covered here as far as the engine and throttle design are concerned, this does cross over to the FS94 and the KM94 as well. They share all the same components. So if you're looking to purchase a line trimmer or an extended hedge trimmer or one of the combination units, I highly recommend the Stihl 94 series. I really like these things. They're great, simple design. They just remind me of a good old school simple two-stroke, and they've been holding up quite well for us over the years. A couple little minor things, here and there, nothing too major, typical of any equipment, but I do recommend them highly. So we sell a ton of these things as well. But if you have any questions, please feel free to leave me a comment down below. I'll do my best to get back to you. And if you want to send me an email, you can find my email in the community tab. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.